morning. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So I wanted to thank Michael and all of you for attending, but also Claire and Innovate Finance for bringing us all together. It's remarkable what's happened in the last 6 months since Innovate Finance was set up. And I know Claire already touched on some of those milestones and achievements, but really it's just been something that has been a huge wave of activity, innovation and investment, and it's something that I just feel privileged to be a part of, which is also why I feel so honored to sort of be presenting today, because I actually feel like I'm a bit of a tailgater in that I'm not one of the innovators, I'm not one of the sort of disruptors or people who are actually building, I think, the new wave of what's happening in fintech. But I do have the pleasure of working with some of these founders and partnering with these companies and hopefully creating sort of the next billion-dollar businesses. So I wanted to just give a little bit of perspective as to why I'm riding this wave or why I'm holding so fast and so hard onto sort of the tailgates or the sort of bumpers, as I say in the US, for these fast-moving cars or this fast-moving traffic. As Michael mentioned, I'm one of the partners at Passion Capital. We're an early-stage venture capital fund, and so we invest in internet startups. We've been doing this since 2011, and we have invested in about 42 businesses to date. Of those, very accidentally, the majority happen to be in fintech. And so I call us sort of an accidental fintech fund. In that 8 of the companies are actually in fintech or financial services. 3 of them are founding members of Innovate Finance. So we are true believers, and hopefully our teams are sort of representing why we think all of this is so promising. What I thought I'd talk about today, though, is sort of why this is all happening now. So as I mentioned, our fund launched in 2011. Our first fintech investment, before we kind of called it fintech or realized that's what it was made in that year. And obviously there have been huge innovations even before that. But why is everybody so excited about this sector now? And why is there so much money and why is there so much attention on it? And in thinking about it, obviously there's the whole notion of why London's the best place to be, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's also, I think, important to think about what's always happened with technology or digital and innovation in general. And if I think about sort of general internet trends and maybe the first dot-com boom, where I was also lucky enough to be in the Bay Area at that time, so I was in the Bay Area from 1994 to 2004, saw the whole dot-com boom and then a bit of the bust before I sort of fled. But you think about what companies were set up in the dot-com boom, and you had, of course, all of your consumer businesses that came first. You had the good ones, and of course you had the bad ones, from the boo.coms or to pets.com, but you also really had the value creation coming from consumer brands and portals, whether it's Yahoo, Google, of course I was part of Skype, but you had things like eBay and Amazon. But then in 1999, at the very, very crest of the dot-com boom, which was really right before it started to drop off of the precipice, you had Salesforce.com founded. And I think that's quite telling, because what always happens is you see innovation starting in what maybe people who are following the space might think of as novelty areas, or just consumer kind of for fun areas. So it might be photo sharing, it might be how do you stay in touch with people, how you communicate with people, and how you kind of do sort of the nice things or the fun things online. And then after a time when it becomes validated, like happened in 1999, you have people thinking, wait a second, we can actually solve true business problems here. We can really bring credibility into the enterprise. We can take the innovations that we've seen in the consumer space and really what some people have been cynically saying are just for novelty's sake, and we can apply those to real practical world problems and create multi-billion-dollar enterprises off the back of that. And I think that's basically what's happening now. So especially here in London, you had a generation of companies that were really targeted at leading edge music services, discovery services, how you find things on your phone, how you make more intelligent decisions for purchasing, how you purchase altogether. And then now people are realizing, after spending some time working on those problems and after working at companies that are solving consumer problems, they're realizing, wait a second, when I used to work at this consultancy or when I used to work at this bank, I realized we had this massive, massive problem, or even as a bank, as sort of customer myself, I realized actually there's a real problem here dealing with money and dealing with problems that have real security needs and are kind of more crushing to what people are doing day to day and not just a novelty or a luxury item. And so I think it's important to think about that in how it's happened before, why it's happening now, and why we're really just at the beginning of what we're going to see in terms of innovation for financial services. So then the why London. And of course, I was in the Bay Area for 10 years, and so a lot of people ask me why I think London can compete against Silicon Valley or even New York, where Wall Street is. And I think the answer is really in kind of how I just posed that, because really what we have in London, very sort of magically, but also fortunately and fortuitously, is a combination of Silicon Valley and Wall Street all in one city. So you have people who have been the financiers, and they've been on Wall Street, they've traded in the big public markets, they've dealt with finance for decades and decades. And then you've got all the software developers and people who have built the first generation of sort of internet or digital successes, and then you've got the blend of those two. You really couldn't marry those kinds of teams in Silicon Valley. You certainly couldn't do it in New York. We have that opportunity here in London, and obviously we've been taking it by the horns. And so over the last 6 months, and arguably over for 2014, you saw statistics whereby more than $500 million was invested in fintech in London alone, and that represents more than 50% of fintech investment in all of Europe. So it's really quite, phenomenal. And off the back of what's happening, you see that it's sort of building off the heritage that we have in London. 300 of the world's banks have their headquarters here in London. More than $2 billion worth of foreign exchange transactions on a daily basis happens and goes through London. And you have something like more than 40,000 knowledge workers in financial services. Add to that the over 140,000 software developers that you have, or digital knowledge workers, and you really do have the perfect sort of blend and all the ingredients lined up to make this the leading place for fintech innovation. So then, I think because I'm a venture capital investor, it's probably worth me talking about why investors are so excited about the space. It might seem obvious, and I guess, preach to my own sort of choir book here, but just to kind of bring it down to really, really bare basics, because we're not really the most, aggressive or innovative industry. We would be called sort of, a lot of people kind of refer to venture capitalists as lemmings, and we'll sort of follow where the money is. But one of the reasons fintech was such an easy thing to come across, or even for us to recognize before it was even called a category or fintech, there's sort of 3 or 4 very, very clear reasons. The first one is that everybody always talks about how big is your market opportunity and your market size, right? I don't think I need to talk about how big financial services is. I've already talked about just what happens on a daily basis for foreign exchange alone. Everybody in the world deals with, worries about, or tries to think about what to do with their money. And if that's not spending in it, if that's not investing it, that's saving it, that's trying to apply it, make it last longer, it's trying to pass it down to maybe future generations. But everyone in the world is worried about money, whether they're capitalists or not. It's what makes the world go round, and there's obviously huge market opportunity in ways to try and make that process more efficient for everyone involved. And then there's also the matter of business model. So, very classic sort of venture capital question is, but what's the business model for this that you're doing? When you're dealing with money, very conveniently, there's always a business model. So there's always more money to take off the top or off the bottom or somewhere in the value chain. And what usually happens when you're talking about financial transactions is you can afford to take a little bit of commission off of the actual transaction or off of the end transaction in the end. And then finally what you have is that you're revenue generative from day one, generally speaking. That's what usually comes along with these sort of revenue models. So for example, we have a fintech company called Go Cardless, which is in our portfolio. They handle direct debits online. It's not very sexy necessarily, but it's something that we probably all do, whether we pay for a TV licensing fee here or we actually pay for our MOT or whatever it is. We're probably paying something on a direct debit. They take over £500 million worth of volume transactions a year now. They don't necessarily have to take even more than a whole percentage point of that in order to make money, but they make a whole lot of money taking actually less than a percentage point off of every single one of those transactions. So from the very first day that they processed their very first transaction, they were generating cash. So all of this, as well as sort of what London has to bear, is kind of why I think we're all here and why I'm so excited about the day and why it's so valuable to get the chance to listen to all the speakers that are going to be here. I think the last thing that I'd want to mention that we have as something not to take for granted here in London and the UK broadly, Claire mentioned too, policymakers and the regulatory environment. And I think this is going to get touched on again later, but not to say that if you didn't take all the ingredients I've already discussed and you transplant them to another city, you still couldn't get the kind of the cooking pot or all of the ingredients that are so important in that HMRC, the Bank of England, and all of these sort of regulators, including the FCA here, are much, much more progressive than most of the other regions and most of the other tech hubs, given how much London has depended on financial services to begin with. So then I guess the question is, where do we go from here? And if I think we're at sort of the cusp, we're at the starting point and kicking all of this off, how much more is there to do? And you'll hear from different people today who are taking financial services from all different angles. Most have to do with what the consumer is going to be doing and how to relieve their pain. Others are going to be on the back end. Maybe others will be platforms like Go Cardless. Others will be tackling fraud, and so they're very much behind the scenes. But we haven't even started to actually tackle every single part of what comprises financial services. So I think the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to see this full stack of what I would call financial services, or what people have traditionally thought banks could deliver, and you're going to see that start to become very modularized. And the banks themselves, if they're innovative, can offer all of these different elements. But what you're going to see happening, I believe, is different companies swapping these in and out. So you have TransferWise doing remittances, you have Azimo doing the same, or WorldRemit. You also have other people now offering sort of pension programs such as Nutmeg. You have all of these different solutions not having to come from the same retail bank, and that's creating more value all the way up and down the stack. Again, more opportunity for the banks as well if they want to work with these companies, but it's really disruption in its very classic sense. Additionally, I think we haven't seen what happens when we cross mobile with all of this. And I think the Gates Foundation has talked a lot about this, especially at the end of last year, in terms of emerging markets and where people don't have traditional bank accounts like we're all used to, in terms of what mobile can do. We're actually going to start seeing mobile-first financial services and delivery, and I think that's just going to make it even 10 times greater in terms of what can be delivered. So in sum, I think it's a hugely exciting time. The last 6 months since Innovate Finance have been set up show how prescient that organization, how Claire was in setting up the organization then and trying to get everybody sort of working together in conjunction with policymakers and everybody else. I think the next 6 months and the next 6 years for London prove to have even more promise. Thank you very much.